meeting of the Pacific Palisades Historical Society and to hear our lecture from Ann about the abalone. My name is Barbara Cohn and I am the current president of the Historical Society. Thank you all very much for coming. Ann?
Thanks for coming, everybody. I'm going to say this really immediately so I don't forget. Very proud to be welcoming Ann Vileisis. I practiced saying that a number of times. She and I have been conversing for almost 2 years about her coming here to do this program. I was part of a National Park Service program where she did a presentation, and I was just so impressed with her knowledge and also her image collection, which is absolutely fabulous. Delighted that she's going to be sharing it tonight. And I think probably for all of us in this room, we can find a place in our heart for the cuddly abalone. I certainly, I spent time as a young girl in Paradise Cove poking around and poking abalones when you could still do that. So my relationship with the abalone has been a long one, and I'm just delighted that we're here to talk about it today and hear more also about efforts to bring it back. So let's welcome Ann Vileisis.
Thank you very much, Anthea, and thank you all so much for coming and joining us tonight. It's really fun to be here with a group of people who really care about and cherish California history, which is what I definitely am interested in. There are so many facets of history, as we've heard described, and it's such an important task to tell stories about our past and learn from it. And some of what I'll be talking about tonight, I think will help to underscore that value. And Barbara, thank you so much for this lovely gift of the blanket. That's a real honor to get this and be part of the history of your community. So I really appreciate that. So I want to begin by just telling you a little bit about how I started to write a book about abalone. I was up the coast a ways in Big Sur, and I was walking in a little cove with black sand, and I was just wandering around exploring the beach, and I came across a shell, and an abalone shell, and it was just brilliant and iridescent, and it just struck me. I just couldn't believe how beautiful it was, and I was literally inspired. I just had to know more about the animal that made that shell. And I'm also a historian. I'm an environmental historian. My interest is in particular about how the people's relationship with nature and how food fits into that lens. And I was aware that abalone had a long heritage as a food item in California, just kind of like lobster in Maine or salmon in the Pacific Northwest. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that. And for a time, abalone was very, very abundant in California. And as I'll explain to you tonight, populations fell very sharply, and now we have 2 abalone species, 2 that are on the endangered species list, and all the others are very imperiled. So when I started to ask around why was this, I found that people of a certain age who'd grown up in California coast had such fond memories of foraging for, diving for, and eating abalone. And these memories were vital, hallowed experiences that people held on to. They literally meant the world to people. And I realized that they were also nostalgic memories. They often ended with just a poignant sadness, a feeling of loss about the past prevalence of abalone being so diminished. There were people blamed sea otters, overfishing, government mismanagement. And while all of these were certainly factors in what happened with abalone, as I dug deeper, I realized that there was a serious mismatch between people's personally remembered experience and memories of what happened with abalone and what a longer, more ecologically grounded knowledge of the history revealed. So not only did the mismatch make people feel really bad about losing abalone, I think it shows that having the wrong story about abalone, in fact, just part of the story, contributed to how abalone have ended up being so imperiled. So I realized that there was an incredibly rich, important history to chronicle and to share with people. And I think that the story of abalone is important to us because it's part of our West Coast heritage, and it's also very relevant as we look ahead to the future and try to figure out how we can conserve marine life as we move forward. So anyway, tonight I'd like to take you on an armchair tour of some of what I learned when I was doing my research. This story, I have to warn you, part of it is joyous, part of it's very sad. There's parts of it that are wondrous, and there's parts of it that I hope will ultimately leave you feeling hopeful. Anyway, without further ado, what I think I'm going to do here is I'm going to switch from this microphone and maybe move this podium a little bit so people to the edge can, there we go. So you can see that, and I'll go down here. And can we turn down the lights now? The stage lights? Okay, so let's begin with the basics. Abalone are marine snails. There are 7 species in California and on the West Coast. I know there's 8 here, but that's kind of the difference between if you're a clumper or a lumper in biology. These beautiful photos were taken by Buzz Owen, who started as a commercial diver back in the 1950s and became a serious self-taught abalone taxonomist. Here he is with a big red abalone shell. Red abalone are the largest species in the world, and this shell is particularly giant. You could literally serve a salad in it. Abalones range the whole West Coast, but especially in California. There's a cluster of species that generally favors cooler northern waters and a cluster that favors warmer southern waters. They also have their own niches of depth, also related to water temperature. So some northern species live in the south in pockets of colder, deeper waters. Most abalone are subtidal. So here's a live red abalone. The holes in their shell that are so typical are respiratory pores, which are used by the animal for breathing, also for expelling wastes, and for broadcasting their gametes for reproduction. Abalone primarily eat kelp, and they sit and wait for little torn off bits and pieces to flow by, which they reach out to lasso with their tentacles. And it's important to underscore that abalone are very slow growing animals. Depending on conditions, it can take them 15 or 20 years or more to reach, an 8-inch kind of size, and sometimes more. One species, the black abalone, is intertidal, adapted to put up with dramatic changes between the ebb and flow of tides. And that brilliant iridescence of all the species owes to a microstructure of tiny carbonite tiles that act like prisms, which you can see those little tiles here with images from a scanning electron microscope. It's kind of phenomenal. So starting at the very beginning, the longest phase of abalone history is before people showed up. The oldest abalone fossils found on the West Coast are nearly 70 million years old, and there they are in a vial, very tiny pebbles, and they were found very close to here up Topanga Canyon. Through millions of years of evolution, abalone developed a big, powerful foot to grip tightly to rocks and a strong shell to clamp down around their bodies as shelter. Both the foot and the shell help to protect them in a sea of hungry predators. But both of these attributes would later become compelling as a delicious meat and as a brilliant and beautiful material when humans showed up. Most archaeologists now think that people first came to North America along the coast, following a kelp forest highway. Some of the earliest evidence for human habitation on the West Coast is the remains of an abalone dinner eaten at the end of the Pleistocene, a single shell dating back 13,000 years. And based on archaeologists' work examining the record of shells out of the Channel Islands, we know that shellfish were important for the subsistence of growing human populations for millennia. About 6,000 years ago, beautiful shell artifacts started to become more common in the archaeological record, revealing that abalone were increasingly used for cultural purposes, tools, ornaments, and ceremonies, and they were traded throughout native communities in California, the desert Southwest, and the Great Basin. And some of these images are of artifacts from Southern California, of the Chumash, ancestral Chumash. Here are some beautiful abalone creations made by indigenous people living around the San Francisco Bay area, collected by British and Russian expeditions around 1800. And this photo of a hupa dancer from more than 100 years later shows abalone used in ceremonial regalia, representing a profound spiritual use of the shell that stretches back thousands of years up and down the coast, and that continues to this day. One of the moving parts of my book research was going to see traditional ceremonial dances of the North Coast tribes, where I learned that abalone is valued not only for its glimmer, but also for its spirit and song, which is the powerful sound that the shells make when they clack together as the regalia is danced to life. So the relationship between people and abalone entered a new phase with the arrival of the Spanish on the West Coast, first with the galleons, and then with missionaries and more mercantilists in the 1700s, a period of history that we're still reckoning with, when indigenous people were subjected to the brutal disruption of their subsistence, culture, and lives, while newcomers with different cultural views took over their ancestral lands. The Spanish soon put abalone to their own use when mariners realized they could pick up brilliant shells near Monterey and then sail north to trade with native peoples far up the coast for sea otter pelts. By the turn of the 19th century, the fur trade moved south to California, decimating sea otters and unwittingly starting to unravel underwater food webs. It turns out that otters are a top predator of abalone, and so without them, abalone that had previously lived in protected crevices reproduced without check and spread out into more exposed areas and became super abundant throughout the near-shore marine environment. Monterey became famous for the shells, which British and American mariners called Monterey shells and California shells. But the name that finally stuck, abalone, was derived from the indigenous word of the local Ohlone people, Aulun, which you can see here as a place name on a historic Monterey map. And so I like to think that the word abalone continues to carry this deep indigenous heritage. The scientific name for California's abalone, Haliotis, also came into use around this time as European scientists started to identify and study American animals. The genus name, Haliotis, means sea ear in Greek, and it was first named by Aristotle because the abalone where he lived in the Mediterranean were the size and shape of human ears. And this illustration from an early 19th century British zoological journal is the very first that I found for a California abalone species, the black abalone. So the most important thing to note about this pivotal time is that the new superabundance of abalone was fundamentally misinterpreted. Newcomers streaming into California regarded plentiful abalone as the natural state of the coast. They didn't realize that they were seeing an ecosystem that had already been severely disrupted. And with the earlier ecological history and traditional knowledge lost, it set us up to misunderstand the biology of this animal. So the next phase of human abalone history begins with the gold rush. Chinese immigrants sailed across the Pacific hoping to find gold, but some found a different treasure on the rocky shores near Monterey in the flourishing abundance of abalone. An abalone rush soon began with hundreds of Chinese gathering abalone from shallow waters. It turns out the Chinese had a long heritage of holding abalone in high esteem for beautiful inlay work, medicinal purposes, and food, and so a large export market quickly developed. Fishermen removed meat from the shells, boiled it, salted it, and then dried it on the beach. The final product was a hard chunk the size of a fist that, according to one reporter, resembled a horse's hoof. You can see the picture there in the middle right. The cured dried meat was savored by the Chinese for a rich umami flavor that it brought to soups. And at the time, white Californians didn't regard abalone favorably as a food at all, owing to racial prejudice and also because they didn't know how to prepare it. So after the easiest to pick abalone were fished out in the Monterey area, the rush spread south. And by the 1870s, the Chinese had developed an extensive trade network with large junks picking up big sacks of dried abalone from fishing camps peppered down the coast to San Diego and beyond into Baja. Millions of abalone were removed, but ultimately the Chinese abalone fishery was ended by broader racial hostilities when Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Acts in the 1880s. About a decade or so after Chinese immigrants were excluded, Japanese fishermen showed up. They too had a long history of favoring the shellfish, and now using the new technology of hard hat dive suits, they took red abalone from deeper waters. And here you can see how there was a whole crew in a small boat. Then they would row around the coves and pump air down the tubes to a diver below and then haul the abalone up. So, as millions of abalone were removed for that export fishery, drying racks and large piles of shells became common sights up and down the coast. And it's important to note that through this period, there were tremendous racial hostilities. And so, in the absence of any other fishery conservation policies or rules, local, state, and federal laws that targeted immigrant fishermen for xenophobic reasons were really the only thing that intermittently restrained this fishery. So almost as soon as the abalone rush had begun, coastal communities and eventually the U.S. Fish Commission raised alarm that too many abalone were being taken. By the turn of the 20th century, the massive buildup of intertidal and shallow-dwelling abalone was in many places diminished from the abundance that people had known and believed to be natural. Newspaper headlines warned that California's abalone were headed for extermination. This was a time when Americans were first becoming concerned about conservation, having witnessed with the demise of otters, bison, passenger pigeons, that we could decimate and even eradicate species through market hunting. On the East Coast, salmon and shad runs had already plummeted too. And in that context, there was an aspiration that California could and should do better with its fisheries by using scientific management. And so the new State Fish and Game Commission set abalone size limits for the first time in 1901, and then directed biologist Charles Lincoln Edwards to study them in Southern California. Learning from the Japanese divers, he became one of the first California marine biologists to take the plunge in a hard hat dive suit. And he became very concerned to see so many abalone being taken. Edward soon affirmed that the risk of extermination was real. He didn't think size limits were enough to protect abalone, and he recommended visionary conservation strategies, including the setting aside of abalone reservations, kind of like what we now call marine protected areas. His biologically based ideas were never acted on, though. Instead, the xenophobic state legislature took a different tack to wholly prohibit abalone exports in 1913. The racially motivated policy did give the slow-growing abalone a reprieve from fishing pressures, though. Meanwhile, a new kind of interest in abalone had grown. With the arrival of the railroad in Los Angeles in the 1870s, affluent tourists started to come to California to appreciate the fresh air and beautiful scenery. And abalone soon became a star attraction, with visitors hunting for shells. At the resort on Catalina Island, one popular activity was to take a glass-bottom boat tour to view undersea marine gardens. And tourists could pay their boatmen a quarter to dive down and retrieve an abalone shell, which soon became a quintessential California souvenir. Here's a souvenir stand run by a Chinese fisherman's family near Monterey. Increasingly, too, more residents and visitors who identified as sportsmen started to hunt abalone for recreation. Kind of got to crack up at these bathing suits. As the shellfish started to become more scarce in the nearshore areas, sportsmen blamed commercial divers for taking too many, while the commercial divers thought that the sportsmen were to blame. This time, a different invertebrate biologist was drawn into the fray, and he determined that red abalone put out millions of eggs each time they spawned. And presuming that the shellfish spawned every year, he theorized that it would be impossible to deplete them as long as the size limits were followed, because the animals would be able to spawn many times before being fished out. His findings affirmed the belief that abalone were inherently super productive and led California's Commercial Fisheries Agency to dismiss all the concerns about conservation. And the idea that size limits could maintain a sustainable fishery became something of a mantra for the state agency. And in that context of enduring surplus abundance, it seemed to work for a while. Unfortunately, no one understood yet how the biology of this animal was fundamentally connected to its ecological history and to the larger environment. So in my book, I braided together different threads of abalone history: how abalone became a commodity through commercial fishing, an icon through recreation, and also the challenge of how early fishery scientists learned about this deep-dwelling animal. But I want to share a few stories of how abalone entered other elements of California culture too. In the early 20th century, the stature of abalone hunting and eating was boosted by this set of well-known poets and writers, including George Sterling, Mary Austin, and Jack London, known as the Carmel Bohemians. After the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, they left the city behind and headed to Carmel to live a simple and creative life. They wrote poems and books and grew their own food, and foraging for abalone became a central part of their scene. The shellfish wasn't just a source of free food, but also a part of their vigor and inspiration. Sterling and London would dive for abalone and then bring them back for beachside dinners. It turns out that an important part of preparing abalone's collagenous meat is that you have to pound it for an extended period. And to make the tedious job more fun, the Bohemians made up lines of rhyming verse to sing while pounding. And it would have remained a playful private game among friends had the writers not been so famous. And I'd say this is a headline from the LA Times that would definitely be clickbait today. I'd click on that article. In particular, Jack London wrote a novel with characters who traveled to Carmel, met up with the writers, and learned their ritual of pounding abalone and singing what would be become known as the Abalone song. And so here we are, we're about halfway through my story, and I think we can use an entertainment break. So I'm going to teach you a couple verses of this song, which capture the Bohemian spirit, and the words are on the screen, and I really hope you'll sing along with me so it'll be less embarrassing for me, and the tune is to Yankee Doodle, okay? So here we go. Oh, some folks boast of quail on toast because they think it's Tony, but I'm content to owe my rent and live on abalone. We sit around and pound, but not with acrimony, because our object is a gob of sizzling abalone. Yay, thank you for singing with me. Hopefully that was as much fun for you as it was for me. And you can see that the Abalone song would go on to become published as sheet music as part of the World's Fair in 1939. So abalone also became famous through the promotional efforts of one of California's first celebrity chefs, Pop Ernest. Pop developed a recipe for abalone fillets akin to the German Wiener Schnitzel. And when the state banned all export of abalone in 1913, he was well positioned to promote it as a premium seafood for California eaters, more specifically white eaters who were still mostly unfamiliar with the shellfish, which you can see he alludes to here in the lower right. He identifies himself as the discoverer of abalone as a white man's delicacy, reminding us again of just the prevalence of racialized thinking back then. Pop eventually built a restaurant right on the Monterey Wharf, which drew tourists and celebrities, and he bought his abalone direct from Japanese fishermen, thereby helping to keep their fishery going strong. So as domestic demand for abalone grew, commercial take continued to grow as well. And as the beds near Monterey wore thin, the industry moved south. Near Morro Bay, the Pierce brothers learned the trade of hard hat diving by watching the Japanese divers, and they started to harvest fresh beds along the central coast. With new gas-powered boats and air compressors, divers could routinely take 100 dozen abalone a day. And by the start of World War II, in just a decade, a small number of divers had fished out 10 million pounds, or about 250,000 animals. Meanwhile, in Southern California, the new sport of skin diving was started in the 1930s. Here are the Bottom Scratchers, the world's first recreational dive club down in La Jolla. And its members would later recall they found abalone everywhere they looked when they first started going underwater with their dive masks. Skin diving and then scuba diving would become increasingly popular, and through the 30s, 40s, and 50s, abalone were taken, eaten, and enjoyed in communities up and down the coast, becoming a central part of California's 20th century beach and recreation culture. So for an overview, you can see here that annual landings from the commercial fishery climbed steadily with a big break in the middle for World War II. That's when the divers and the Japanese-American abalone fleet were basically totally put out of work because of the wartime internment of Japanese-American citizens. But when the fishery resumed after the war, this time with many returning veterans joining its ranks, the catch ramped up to a high peak of more than 5 million pounds taken per year in 1958. But then soon thereafter, you can see the top there with the arrow, soon thereafter in the mid to late 60s, commercial landings began to drop and then plummet without much advance warning. And so what happened is the $6 million question. It was not one, but a number of things, of course, hitting like big waves, one after another, piling on to finally erode that historic mass of built-up broodstock, and ultimately to reduce populations of some species to alarmingly low levels. First, in Central California, sea otters rebounded. It had been thought that these animals were wholly extirpated from California by the fur trade, but a small population was discovered near Big Sur in 1938. It slowly expanded southward and by the late 1950s entered an area near San Simeon considered to be the most productive abalone beds in the state. Look at all that kelp. It soon became clear that they loved to eat abalone. It turns out that otters forage for abalone by breaking their shells with a rock. This set off a bitter and intractable conflict between the commercial abalone fishermen who wanted the state to move the sea otters elsewhere and those rooting for sea otter recovery. As the fishermen saw it, the sea otters didn't follow size limits and were eating down what they considered to be the natural broodstock, their broodstock, since it supported their livelihoods. On the other hand, the otter supporters saw sea otters resuming their rightful place in the marine ecosystem. And this is a key pivot point in our story, because up until this time, people believed that abalone were an inexhaustible seafood and that their prevalence was natural and owed to the animal's inherent superproductivity. But the return of the sea otter pointed to a whole new understanding. In short, there would have been no abalone fishery at all had the sea otters not been decimated earlier. And it finally became apparent that the abalone fishery had been based on a historic mass of built-up stock, a windfall that was being increasingly mined out by fishermen and now by otters too. At the time, knowledge of kelp forest food webs with sea otters as a keystone species influencing the entire ecosystem was still just emerging, based in part on new ecological research in Alaska, where scientists were studying islands and they found islands with otters had far richer kelp forests where the otters were present compared to the islands where there are no otters. And many of you may be familiar with this, but for those who aren't, the drawings on the far right show the basics. On the top, the otter keeps kelp-grazing urchins in check, allowing for a rich kelp ecosystem to flourish. And on the bottom, when the urchins become dominant and graze down the kelp, it simplifies the whole ecosystem. It was impossible to apply this new science from Alaska to more complex ecosystems with more elements in California, especially in the midst of such a contentious conflict. But it was the start of a paradigm shift where we began to see the wild animals that we use as foods not only as a crop to be harvested every year, but also as parts of more complex ecological communities. There was simply a lot more going on underwater than anyone had known. And I want to underscore that this was a situation where the way that everyone, from fishermen, fishery managers, community members, and scientists, had been perceiving marine ecosystems, their lived experience and memories was literally challenged, dissolved, and had to be reconstituted. It was a case where people could see things one way and then another, not unlike iridescence. Most important, because we'd inherited the wrong story or just part of the story, it had set us up not only to misperceive the biology and ecology of these animals, but also to be poorly positioned when additional stressors started to hit. As the sea otters expanded their range southward, fishermen were compelled to abandon their prized Central Coast abalone beds. Ultimately, the sea otters became a protected species. And though red abalone persisted and continued to persist in protected cracks and crevices, there were no longer was a surplus for commercial fishing. And at that point, California's commercial abalone divers moved south again. And with bigger, more powerful boats, they focused their work on reefs not only on the mainland, but also around the Channel Islands, where recreational take also increased with more party boats heading out to the islands. But despite the newly emerging understanding of abalone's history, there was no commensurate adjustment in how the fishery was managed. By the 1970s, state biologists determined that overfishing had already significantly reduced abalone broodstock in many areas of Southern California, and the animals just couldn't keep up. They tried to ratchet back the commercial fishing pressure, but the politics proved impossible, in part because people believed that the sea otters would just simply continue to expand their range, and they figured, well, we better get them before the sea otters do. Meanwhile, another thing happened in Southern California. El Niños, a big one in 1958, and then an even more massive one in 1983, which some of you may well remember. Until the 1980s, everyone had considered the warm water and big storms to be aberrations. No one yet realized El Niños were sporadic, but regular oceanic fluctuations tied to larger oceanographic cycles. Strong El Niños affected abalone in several ways. They devastate kelp that abalone eat, reducing the animal's growth, but also their ability to reproduce. Until this time, you'll remember, it was generally presumed that abalone reproduced every year. But scientists who studied what happened to abalone before and after the 1983 El Niño discovered this was not the case, in fact. However, that wasn't really realized until many years later, so fishing continued on the stocks that were not regularly reproducing. It turns out that these early, strong El Niños were like postcards from the future, already starting to show us the insidious ways that extended periods of elevated seawater temperature could deeply affect marine life. And in the wake of the 1983 El Niño, another problem hit. This before photo was taken on Santa Rosa Island in the early 1980s, where black abalone, the one intertidal species, still thrived. Look at them all spread out all over the rocks. So biologists that were surveying marine life in the intertidal zone in the newly designated Channel Islands National Park soon found that the black abalone that normally clamped hard to the rocks during low tide were hanging limp and loose and then dropping off helpless. The biologists soon realized that they were witnessing an epidemic. Over the course of just a few short years, 99% of the black abalone in the Channel Islands withered up and died. And then the mysterious pathogen made it to the mainland and spread up and down the coast too. It was alarming for the biologists to see so many animals die in such a short time. They called it withering syndrome, and ultimately pathologists would determine it was caused by a bacterium that became particularly active in warm water, and that it could afflict other species of abalone too, albeit to a lesser degree. And if that weren't enough, the biologists soon realized that no one had seen a white abalone in quite a long time either. When they failed to find them with regular dive surveys, they searched deeper waters with a small submarine. Here's one of the biologists climbing into the Delta sub, and over the course of several days, Park Service and California Department of Fish and Game researchers surveyed 77,000 square meters of reef and found only 4 white abalone. Here's a view, kind of blurry, from their sub looking at a lone white abalone on a rock. And reviewing the historic fisheries data and surveys, the biologists hypothesized that the once abundant animals had been unwittingly fished out, leaving too few animals too far apart to reproduce. It's called the Ali effect. When animals' populations are reduced to extremely low levels, they have trouble reproducing because mates can't find each other. And in the case of abalone, the animals' gametes broadcast out into seawater can't find each other. And so this realization made the abalone biologist realize that it was critically important to monitor not just the numbers of abalone, but the density of the clusters and aggregations too. So as the biologists pieced together the dire straits of the black and white abalone in Southern California in the early 1990s, these animals, along with pink, green, and red abalone pictured here, were still being fished commercially, and they were increasingly vulnerable to poaching too. And at that point, the state biologists came to the painful realization that California could no longer manage abalone for fisheries. It had to manage them to survive. And this is another crucial pivot point in the story. In my book, I tell the truly gripping tale of how recreational divers from throughout California came together in a contentious, high-stakes political campaign to press the state to finally close the commercial fishery and also their own sport fishery from San Francisco south, with the aim of saving abalone broodstock so that they could save this animal for the future. Ultimately, the white abalone would become the first marine invertebrate to be listed as an endangered species in 2001. And the black abalone would be listed as well in 2009. And in retrospect, it's important to observe that it was not easy for fishery managers to foresee when these animals would reach a critical tipping point, from being wholly available for the fishery to becoming imperiled. And even in the face of the warning signs, it was hard to ratchet back California's abalone fisheries because fishers vigorously argued that there were more animals out there to fish, even as the populations and distribution of abalone shrunk, and even as those cumulative environmental threats piled on. So, to me, this underscores the importance of taking a precautionary approach to managing all the animals we still use as wild foods, and ideally of having an agreed upon management plan in place ahead of time so everyone can be on the same page when the chips are down. And I think it also points to the need for people from more diverse perspectives, not just fishers, to become engaged and to advocate for sustainable fisheries and conservation in the public processes that lead to management decisions for these kinds of wild animals we use as foods. Okay, so I want to shift gears now and tell you some of what's been happening to some of these animals more recently. So with the endangered white abalone, the animals were so few and so far apart that biologists knew there would be no way they could ever reproduce on their own. So back in the late 90s, they decided to bring in some of the few remaining animals from the wild to start a captive breeding program. In my book, I recount this effort with all its monumental challenges and amazing discoveries. The bottom line is that it's much harder to recover an endangered species than it would have been to conserve it in the first place. But after some heartbreaking setbacks, in the past several years there have been some exciting milestones of success. Scientists finally figured out how to breed large numbers of healthy juveniles. Here you can see one of these animals up close. It's kind of cute. And NOAA Fisheries, which has purview over recovery of endangered marine species through the Endangered Species Act, has funded and pulled together many key partnering organizations in Southern California, including the Santa Monica Bay Foundation, several universities in Southern California, and several of the coastal aquaria to scale up the recovery effort. And in the fall of 2019, captive raised white abalone were finally outplanted in Southern California for the first time. And since then, more than 10,000 have been outplanted in 2 sites off the coast in Southern California. So putting these baby abalone out into the ocean with all its predators is certainly still part of the challenge for recovery. And so they're testing different methods to see what will work best to protect these animals until they can become established. And remarkably, too, some additional wild abalone have been discovered, which is helping scientists to better understand these animals and also to provide for some more genetic diversity. This is a continuing project, and the ultimate goal is to get lots of white abalone pulse planted out into the ocean where they can reproduce on their own and help rebuild a viable population. And hopefully all that's being learned in recovering these most endangered abalone can be applied, if need be, to other species and to other marine animals in the future. So with the endangered black abalone, the intertidal species most heavily afflicted by withering syndrome, the approach to recovery has been different. It was always hoped that there might be some pockets of disease-resistant animals out there. And it turns out that in a few places in the Channel Islands, black abalone have persisted and may now be starting to show some signs of rebound. They've also persisted in Central California where the water is colder. When I first started doing research for my book back in 2010, I joined National Park Service biologists in their monitoring work, which included surveys for these remaining pockets of endangered black abalone. And we found only a very few, including some that were still very sick. But then, an unexpected and hopeful, surprising thing happened. In 2013, scientists studying withering syndrome discovered something different when they were assaying tissues of abalone. It turned out to be a virus, a bacteriophage that breaks down the disease bacterium. And additional research has confirmed that abalone afflicted by withering syndrome can endure the infection better and with far fewer symptoms if the virus is present too. And in recent years, researchers have determined that that bacteriophage virus has now spread through most California waters where withering syndrome is present, and may now be making it possible for black abalone and very likely for other species to recover. And so, believe it or not, in this abalone story, a virus may well be the hero. It's hard to believe, but yes. Meanwhile, the pink and green abalone of Southern California never became endangered, but they became severely depleted. After more than 25 years of fishing closure now, they may be slowly starting to rebound in some spots and in some marine protected areas. On the mainland and still empty nearshore reefs of Orange County, efforts to kickstart green abalone recovery have been spearheaded by marine biologist and volunteer coordinator Nancy Caruso. Planning closely with state biologist Nancy has collected wild broodstock from Catalina and is now raising green abalone at local aquaria with the aim to outplant them and rebuild a local nearshore population in her community. Nancy and her team of volunteer divers who do surveys, monitoring, and watchdogging of the restored abalone exemplify what it means for people to develop a new kind of relationship with abalone, built on an ethic of getting to know and care about local places and getting inspired to restore and steward marine life. And finally, we must return to the red abalone of Northern California. Since the opening of the Golden Gate Bridge in 1938, when recreational shore picking of abalone and then free diving became important for tourism, North Coast communities fought hard to keep commercial abalone fishing and diving and scuba diving out so that they could conserve their prized shellfish. They wanted breath hold diving only. And as a result, a tightly managed free diving sport fishery had continued to thrive based still on that historic buildup of abalone broodstock, continually replenished by red abalone parents in waters that were deeper than could be reached by any divers holding their breath. Thousands of divers and shore pickers were coming each year from all over the state to hunt for abalone in the kelp-rich coves, and then repair to campgrounds to pound and fry up abalone in a tradition that in some families spanned generations. But then a perfect storm of environmental stressors hit. In 2011, there was a harmful algal bloom that killed off hundreds of abalone off the Sonoma coast. In 2013, a wasting disease swept up the whole coast, decimating sea stars, including these sunflower stars, now considered to be mostly extirpated and are now a candidate for the endangered species list themselves. Turns out those sea stars are important predators of purple urchins, and so without them, aggressive kelp-eating urchins grew without check. Then in 2014, a marine heat wave hit called the blob from the north and El Nino from the south, making it harder for the bull kelp, which need cold, nutrient-rich water to grow. Between the ravenous urchins and warm water, Northern California's rich kelp forests were reduced by more than 90% in just a few years, leading to the starvation of thousands of red abalone and the closure in 2017 of that long popular sport fishery. So the massive scale and speed of this undersea transformation has been heartbreaking. And unfortunately, on the outermost Channel Islands, which share similar oceanographic conditions and ecological communities as Northern California, we've got a similar situation, with some of the richest kelp forests on the West Coast now being reduced to urchin barrens, with profound consequences for abalone and all of marine life. And so I see abalone, through their plight in all of this, as sentinel animals, calling us to recognize their increasing vulnerability and the vulnerability of all marine life in the face of our climate crisis. Many people are now looking at different ways to address this daunting suite of problems coastwide. In Northern California, there are efforts to create urchin-free oases with sport and commercial divers removing the purple urchins in strategic coves to maintain pockets of kelp and red abalone and other animals in kind of little oases of biodiversity. Some scientists are now working to bring back the sunflower sea star through a captive breeding program. And in Oregon, where I live, a consortium of tribes and NGOs is pressing to consider the reintroduction of sea otters if there could be enough for them to eat. In Southern California, there's long been efforts to restore patches of degraded mainland kelp forests, and so there are lessons to draw from there too. But while all these actions can help to conserve biodiversity, ocean conditions remain the overarching driver for canopy kelps. Meanwhile, we've also come to realize that these great undersea forests are incredibly important for sequestering carbon and thereby helping to stabilize larger climate conditions too. So kelp is key, everything is connected, and there's a lot at stake. And so as citizens of the West Coast and of planet Earth, we find ourselves at another pivotal moment, which underscores to me why history is so important. The stories that we tell ourselves about how we got to now are literally the stepping off point for the future. Through the history that I've shared, I hope you've gained an appreciation for some of the profound and enduring cultural values of abalone. We've seen how earlier generations derived tremendous economic benefit and vital enjoyment from abalone. But now these animals need for us to give something back. And hopefully the perspective of history, what we've gotten wrong and right in the past, and all that we've learned can inspire and help us in this project. We need more people to learn and care about marine environments, to fall in love with the rich beauty of these places, their plants and animals, and to get involved in supporting community science efforts. We need for more people to advocate for abalone recovery, for endangered species, and for marine ecosystems. And on a personal level, that can mean reducing use of plastics and household chemicals or anything else that will end up polluting the ocean and degrading water quality. There are really no easy answers, but we will need to come together to find ways to rebuild resilience in our marine ecosystems if we want marine life to endure with us into the future. As I worked on my book, a telling detail that I discovered early on stuck with me. That many different cultures from all around the Pacific Rim have associated abalone with vision. And so it's my hope that sharing this story of abalone can help us all to see a better path forward for these cherished kindred creatures and for all the life of our sea and earth. So thank you very much for your attention tonight and this story. And I do have some, thank you. And I can take some time to answer questions if people have them. And then I've also got books that I would love to sell you if anybody's interested over there at the table. And I've also got some shells if people want to look at them too, because it's really beautiful if you've not had a chance to see an abalone shell in a while to look at them. So that was kind of a lot to take in, but does anybody have any questions? Yes, Donna.
Can you explain a little bit more about, for instance, the size of the abalones that we've been looking at and what their age is?
Yeah, the question is what's the size of abalone and what is their age? And so different species can grow to different lengths. And so red abalone, as I described, is the biggest one. And that was the one that looked like the salad bowl. For an abalone to grow to that size, I mean, it might have taken like 25, 30 or more years to get to that size. If they are living in cold water and there's a lot of kelp, they can grow faster. If they live in places where there's less kelp, they could grow slower. Some of the species, like the black abalone, only grow to like 7 inches maximum. So each species literally is its own animal and has its own whole story. So does that help?
Yes, so when they spawn, when do they start creating their shell? And are they sedentary for life then?
They end up becoming a little larval animal that floats around in the ocean, and then they settle down onto rocks, places that they actually have ability to sense places that are good, that have pink coralline algae. There's a substance that they emit that the abalone sense they know where to settle. That's good for them. And then they stay there or hide in cracks and crevices where they can grow to a large enough size where they're protected by their shell. That usually takes 4 to 6 years. They can then start to reproduce. And most abalone, many of them stay very sedentary. If they're in a good spot, they'll stay there and wait till the kelp comes to them. Or they line up. You might have seen some of the abalone lined up on kind of in lines where there are channels, where the tide channels where the water comes in and out and carries kelp in and out. If they're not in a good place, they'll move elsewhere. But so it kind of depends. They can move. They can actually move very quickly. There's stories that if they encounter, they don't like sea stars or octopus. If they get a scent of them, they take off and go running and try to hide. So anyway, yeah, they're interesting. Yes, a question there?
With climate change and our oceans, acidifying and becoming warmer, are there any mitigating, is there research or are they doing anything to preserve them since our upwelling is?
Yes, I think so. The question is about climate change, in particular the issue of ocean acidification, which is that as the ocean is holding more carbon, the ocean is actually getting more, sorry to you guys that I have my back to you, the ocean is getting more acidic. And so animals that have shells, sadly, are having a hard time making their shells. And so animals that are larval animals that have to build their shells, they have to go through their embryonic life phase and then start to grow and build shells, have an even harder time. So there's studies now figuring out can they withstand that, what's going to happen, and they are going to have a harder time, and one of the things that gives me hope is that we know that animals can evolve, and they have evolved in the past through different conditions, and we just have to make sure there's enough of them out there and are protected and can hopefully get through that bottleneck. But it's hard, and yes, they're probably, I mean, like right now, the place where shells are being most impacted now, where they're looking into this, is like with oyster shells up in the Pacific Northwest, where there's oyster farms that are having trouble, and they're trying to change the chemistry of the water, you know, by changing the pH. But that can happen in an abalone farm, or I mean, in an oyster farm. You can't really obviously do that in the ocean. So that's still a research topic in progress. But we have to hope that these animals that have been around for 70 million years, if we can give them the space and protection to grow, that hopefully they can evolve and adapt. Yes?
Can we eat them like raw, like the oysters, like we eat oysters?
Well, you can eat them raw if you can find them. There's a recipe that people have made, though more like a ceviche. I think it's not, it would be too chewy to eat raw. But I know people, when I was doing my research, I heard from some people who were divers who would just go out and take them and eat them raw. And they felt like that was a very kind of powerful and vital thing to do. But they're really no longer available for you to eat right now because they're so imperiled. So the only way you can eat them in California right now is to eat farmed abalone. And there aren't a lot of abalone farms because the animals take so long to grow. There's one in Goleta. There's one that I believe supplies kind of high-end restaurants. There's one I'm aware of up in Monterey, that right on the wharf where you can go and buy them, but just small ones, you know. They're very expensive. But at fancy restaurants, you can still get them and try them.
Do you know of any?
Do I know of any? I don't know.
Fancy restaurant?
No, I don't know. I've looked. I've kind of was thinking it would be fun to try eating them sometime in that way, but I haven't tracked them down lately here. But I'm sure you could find them around somewhere in Los
Google it,
Angeles.
right?
What?
Google it.
Google it, yeah. That's going to be your research project, or anybody who wants to, you can look. So it's very interesting. When I was doing my research, I thought I have to try to figure out I have to have this experience. This experience of diving for and eating abalone is such a quintessentially California experience. And I was writing a book that was focused on the animal. I wanted to tell the story of what happened to the animal, but I was also very interested in the human-animal relationship. So I wanted to have that experience. So I went to Northern California in 2013. I had a friend who was a diver, and he took me, and we went out and snorkeled, and he dove down and got them, and we went back to the campground and pounded them and did everything, and I ate them, and it was delicious. And it turns out that was really the last year, because the year after that, I described all those problems, and so we just wouldn't have been able to go up and do it after that, because everybody would have known that there was a decline and they were really struggling. And now there are abalone that are up in Northern California they're struggling. Some of them have come in shallow waters. They're looking for kelp. They're looking for anything to eat. And so, it gets back to that thing where I was saying we have to figure out how to kind of get them through the bottleneck. We have to make sure that there are oases where they can survive, so there's enough of them that can hopefully get through. That's building resilience to figure out how we can keep them going. Yes, Barbara.
I have a question. Are abalone considered the same as shellfish, shrimp, crab, lobster? And do they have iodine, so people who are allergic to shellfish cannot eat abalone?
I have never heard that. They're a different kind of animal. So shrimp and lobsters are crustaceans.
Yes.
This shellfish is kind of a general term. This one is more like a snail. It's a mollusk. Mollusks are more like, there are some of them that are bivalves, that are like oysters. Abalone is really its own thing. And so I've never heard of people having that trouble. Anyway, yes?
What about the kelp forests are really, like you say, declining? Has anyone come up with an idea to get rid of the sea urchins? I mean, if there's a real problem, it's not the divers now, ocean's not warming that much to kill them. It's the urchins, as I understand it. Has anyone got an anti-urchin animal other than?
Well, the big anti-urchin animal is the sea otter, of course, but what they've tried to do so far, they've been through different phases of this. So back in the 50s and 60s, there were patches of die-off where there were urchin barrens developed. Famously down near White's Point, you know, where the sewage outfall was. Excuse me one second. And so it used to be people would go out and smash the urchins and put lime on them. Excuse me. Try to get rid of them that way. They did that, and they ultimately thought that what really got the kelp to come back was that the conditions changed and it came back. More recently, they've tried to, you know, replant the kelp in places that were depleted, and that seems to be helpful. In Northern California, there's a guy who invented a kind of vacuum cleaner for trying to get urchins out. And there's been some efforts to have urchin divers gather them up, bring them onto land, and feed them other kinds of seaweed so that you could fatten them up and develop a market for uni, which is the gonad of the urchin that's a high-end seafood. But I don't think we're going to sushi ourselves out of this. I mean, there's just bazillions of these creatures. So it may be that there will become a pathogen for them that will, you know, one thing people ask is, well, how can sea urchins live? When they run out of food, don't they eat things down and there's nothing left to eat? They are just so, they can just hang on forever.
They eat each other.
I don't know about that, but they can just go into this dormant state and just hold on tight and just survive and survive for like decades. So anyway, they're definitely fascinating creatures too. And they all have a role, you know, so it's just that things get out of balance. Any more questions? Oh yes, here.
Is there a range of abalone? I mean, is it anywhere else in the world, or is this it?
Yeah, the question is, are there abalone elsewhere in the world? There's about 70 species around the world. And so they're also fish, and they all have basically the same type of problem. They're all overfished. Excuse me, they're all prone to the problems because they're all slow-growing animals, and they're all coveted because people love the meat and they love the shell. But there are, all around the Pacific Rim, there are larger abalone in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. There are some too. In Europe as well are the little ones called ormers. So anyway, yeah, they're all over the place.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, one more.
So way back in the day when I was in my 20s, I actually had abalone at Jack's at the Beach, which was an old restaurant at the end of the Santa Monica, the Pacific Ocean Park Pier. And I noticed over the years, and they also had it at the Galley on Main Street down in Ocean Park. But now what they do is they use squid, you know, they pound it and they'll say, like even in markets, they'll put abalone style, you know.
Yeah.
So would squid be considered in the same type of, you know, muscle meat like that?
Well, so the question is, this woman is remembering that she used to get abalone down at restaurants down on the Santa Monica Pier area.
Yeah, the Pacific Ocean Park Pier.
Pacific Ocean Park Pier. And she's saying that now she goes down there and she sees that they sell squid and they call it abalone-like.
Abalone style, you know.
Abalone style,
in
yeah.
State,
Yeah, and so she's asking, is it similar or not? And I would say, I don't think it is. So you are right that squid is also a mollusk, but it's a different class of mollusk. It's a cephalopod, and as opposed to the gastropod. And Haliotis, the abalone, is its own genus, and it's a different kind of meat. So I would say, I mean, they're trying to give you something that's similar, and maybe the flavor, maybe some of you who have tasted both could talk about that, but I don't think it's the same. It's different.
It's definitely not the same.
But I just I'm going to end here so that, and if anybody has further questions, you can ask me. But I think this points to the fact that those of you guys who are interested in local history, I think it would be really a cool project to think about local food and local foods in this community and your connection to your ocean and seafood too. So I bet you there are old menus from local restaurants that have some interesting things. It's an interesting part of history that helps people connect to the past. So anyway, yes?
And I'd like to thank you very much for coming tonight. And for those of you, her books are available at the table, and I'm sure she'd be happy to sign them for you.
Thank you, Barb.
Thank you all for coming, and hopefully we'll have another event from the Historical Society, and we will let you all know.
Thank you.